Hello everyone, in this review we continue Requests Month with Call of Juarez for PC and Xbox 360. This review is coming to you courtesy of L2 Nuku. He sent me this, so thank you, it is greatly appreciated. This is a first-person shooter and the first game in the Call of Juarez series. It was developed by Techland and first released in Europe in 2006 for PC, and then later on in other regions, and an Xbox 360 release came out in 2007. And this game was noteworthy for a few reasons. The first of them being that it's a Western-themed first-person shooter. We don't really get a lot of those. And so this kind of came out of nowhere as far as genre goes. You didn't expect it to be a Western game in the modern era. It just doesn't happen very much. Other things of note were that this is one of the first games to use DirectX 10, so that in itself was interesting to see how they handled it, what this new technology offered, that sort of thing. And, of course, we know now that Call of Juarez spawned an entire series. It's now with the latest one being Gunslinger. So, the question becomes, is Call of Juarez really worth playing now that all these sequels have come out, and despite one of them being pretty much nothing to do with any of the other Call of Juarez games? Is it a good game in and of itself? Is it worth playing? Or is it more of a curiosity or something like that? Well, as far as the presentation goes, you may think that, oh, well, it's one of the first games to use DirectX 10. That must mean it looks good, right? Not really. It looks decent, but even at the time, there were games that looked better than this. And it just didn't look all that great compared to even other first-person shooters, some of which had been released quite a while before it. So what you ended up having here is a game that, while it technically uses DirectX 10, it doesn't really look all that great. The effects and everything don't really look any better than DirectX 9 does. In fact, I noticed really no difference between the two versions. You can run it in either mode, and I mostly ran it in DirectX 9 because DirectX 10 mode saw a at least 20 to 30 frames a second drop for no noticeable reason. Same settings and everything. Just for some bizarre reason, DirectX 10 mode just ran a lot worse. I don't know why, it just did. So, that's just worth noting. And with no real noticeable difference between the two modes, I really can't see the draw of DirectX 10. It's just kind of a novelty rather than anything that's actually worth using. But, by and large, the presentation just looks a bit dated even for its time, which is kind of odd. But by that I mean, in particular, the animations. They look dated. They look like something out of the earlier 2000s rather than the mid to late 2000s. And it's particularly noteworthy because they just end up taking you out of the experience. People move oddly. The weapon animations just look odd. And that sort of thing just kind of pulls you out of the experience a bit. Especially considering that other games at the time did this better. So, it's just something that really took me out of the experience, even though technically the graphics aren't bad. It was just one of those stylistic things where if they had improved the animations, I would have gotten into it more. That said, environments generally look fine despite being mostly the whole brown and gray and realistic thing. Now, I admit that it's a Western game, so a lot of it's going to be brown. It's basically out west. There's not much other than brown. But I still would have liked to see more color in it. And that's just something that has really bothered me ever since that switch to that style has taken hold. It just seems like we can't really get out of that rut, except for a few games here and there. But other than that, the visuals are serviceable. They just look a bit dated, even for the time they were released, and the DirectX 10 features really aren't all that impressive, and obviously the oddities take a lot of getting used to. What about the sound design? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The music's okay. It fits Western setting, but that's about all I can say about it. It didn't really strike me as memorable or anything like that. It was just there. The voice acting runs the gamut from very solid, like when you're playing as Ray, and he's constantly sounding like a pretty much psychopathic preacher. Sounds pretty awesome, actually. To a lot of the NPCs sounding really ridiculous and cheesy. So it runs the gamut, and that's not exactly a good thing. It's rather jarring sometimes. Sound effects in general are pretty solid, however. Guns sound pretty good, but the rest of the sound effects just fit. They don't necessarily sound good or bad, they just fit. But it is nice that they actually managed to make the guns sound fairly powerful. But obviously what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as two characters throughout the course of the game. The first of them is Billy. He is this drifter of Mexican descent, and he comes home from hunting the legendary gold of Juarez, unsuccessfully of course, to find that his mother and stepfather have been killed. And he happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his step-uncle, Reverend Ray McCall, the other character you play, thinks that he's the one who did it. So Ray goes after him, while Billy is trying to run away. And this is how the story goes for a large chunk of the game until it gets more complicated later on. But by the time it gets more complicated, you don't care. And you don't care for a couple of reasons. The first of them being that the storytelling is just not very engaging. It doesn't really try anything that you haven't seen in any other FPS at the time. And it's rather weak writing as a whole. It may just be that it was translated, because Techland is, I believe, a Polish company. But it just feels odd as far as its storytelling goes, partly because of how the actual gameplay works. And it's so jarring in spots that you just end up not caring about the way the story goes and focus almost entirely on the gameplay instead. It really doesn't help as well that Billy himself is an extremely unlikable character. He whines the entire game. It's ridiculous. And he's pretty much useless. All he can do is run away and sneak around. Whereas Ray is a total badass. He's a reverend, and he runs around quoting the Bible while blasting his way through hordes and hordes and hordes of bad guys. Now you can see where this is a very jarring juxtaposition as far as the gameplay mechanics go. On the one hand, if you're playing as Billy, you're sneaking around a lot, you're using stealth kills and such like that with the bow and arrow, and you're relying more on being very quiet and taking out enemies very slowly one at a time. And if you play as Ray, it's pretty much balls to the wall action. You're just mowing down hordes and hordes and hordes of bandits and whatever gets in your way, really. And so they're completely different playstyles. It's really jarring to go from one to the other. And so what ends up happening is that you find the Billy bits actually rather annoying, at least as far as I'm concerned they were, because the stealth mechanics in this game just don't work very well. They are extremely rudimentary. It's basically stick to the shadows and remain crouched. Okay? They still spot you anyway half the time, but oh well. And whenever you're playing as Billy, you're not really in a good position to take out the enemies if they actually manage to spot you. So the stealth bits come across as half-baked. It's like they just didn't really think it all the way through. And unfortunately, these are rather common throughout the game. And there's a lot of them where it's, if you get spotted, guess what? Yeah, you gotta start over. It's ridiculous. Meanwhile, you play as Ray and you're just mowing down hordes of bad guys, dual-wielding revolvers, and taking barely any damage because you're just shrugging off hits left, right, and center. He actually wears a breastplate, so he'll actually shrug off hits on occasion. You get the focus mode where it goes into slow-mo and you can fire each revolver individually. So you can take out a bunch of enemies in rather quick succession while it's in slow-mo because they can't really react to you. And you're just pulling off all of these feats of badassery. And to put the icing on the cake, you can whip out a Bible in one hand and a revolver in the other and just go around mowing down bad guys while quoting the Bible. It gets ridiculous. It's completely absurd when you're playing as Ray, and that's actually the fun part of the game. When you're just going around mowing down all these bad guys, it gets ridiculous and you can't help but find it amusing. And then it goes straight from that into a level where you're playing as Billy. And instantly the pace has gone from balls-to-the-wall action to slow, sneaky crap. And that's really my main problem with the game. It's that pacing is just so off. These two characters are two completely different playstyles, and when you smash them together in the game, it just doesn't work. One of them works, and that's when you're playing as Ray. And those are the cool bits of the game. Whenever I switched over to Billy, I found myself dreading it, because more often than not, it just annoyed the living crap out of me. So, it's this really weird experience going through this game. I mean, mechanically, it feels a bit off sometimes. I mean, shooting doesn't exactly feel great. It works, but it doesn't feel great. The slow-mo mechanics seem a bit rudimentary. I mean, granted, this was the first game in the series. I can cut it some slack there, but duels just don't feel all that exciting. They're there. They're not that exciting. And the stealth bits just ruin the experience as a whole. So what are you left with? At best, a serviceable FPS. Whenever you're playing as Ray, which is about half the time. The rest of the time, you're finding it rather annoying, because now you're playing as Billy, and Billy's a wimp. So, it's one of those situations where I really can't recommend playing this game, particularly considering that the sequels did such a better job with the pacing and the Wild West feel. And it's a shame, really, because I wanted to like this, because just of what it meant later on down the line and what it means to me, because I'm a big fan of Westerns, but I just couldn't like it. Ultimately, I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.